Loneliness and Technology. And this event is on mapping feminist loneliness. My name is Jess Cotton. I'm a lecturer in English at Cardiff University and the organiser of this special interest group. I'm delighted to be joined this evening by Dr. Eleanor Kellis, Professor Margareta Jolly and Dr. Celeste Orr. Dr. Kellis will present a paper on her research as part of the Business of Women's Words project. Professor Jolly, who leads the Business of Women's Words project, will kind of introduce the talk shortly after my introduction, and then Dr. Orr, who has recently co-edited a very exciting special issue of Feminist Theory, which I believe is out soon, on feminist learning studies, will provide a response to the paper. So I'm delighted that this event is happening. I've been thinking for some time about loneliness, how kind of loneliness has been one of the key feelings that has driven women to organise kind of politically, and how loneliness often serves as a barometer to understand the inadequacy of gender roles and social provisions alike. Feminist loneliness studies is really kind of in its inception, as we will learn more from its forthcoming publication. And it brings into view a host of questions about the distinctive forms of loneliness created by gender and sexuality, as well as a host of other kind of factors and variables. So feminists have often been lonely because feminism is hard work, and because feminism has often demanding, isolating, as well as kind of joining communities. A lot of the time, feminism demands saying no, being a killjoy, to borrow Sarah Ahmed's phrase, doing the work of refusal, can often mean isolating oneself from a certain social context. Being part of a feminist collective might mean isolating oneself from other social forms of organisation. Feminism also provides a lens that allows us to think about how we might begin to record and register, and thus to think kind of more creatively and historically about loneliness's social life and the social policies and care strategies that might make lonely lives more livable, and indeed we might say more political. A feminist attention to loneliness brings into view the affordances of a systematic critique that allows us to see how loneliness is not simply registered as an individual kind of feeling, but is generated by social economic conditions, by race, by class, by the kind of neoliberal gig economy, by ableism, as Dr. Harriet Barrett explored so interestingly in her paper on Motherhood's Lonely States on the 18th of March. So thinking about loneliness through the lens of feminism allows us to see how loneliness is not an individual problem, but is instead deeply related to social processes. Tracing loneliness opens up questions about the relationship between the centre and periphery of kind of where we think feminism is kind of located, and about the distributions of resources and how we might go about kind of managing states of isolation, states that are obviously particularly exacerbated at the moment. When the Hastings Women's Study Group set out to investigate the topic of women and loneliness in 1984, they concentrated on women's lives and relationships, looking at young single women, motherhood, marriage and loneliness, widowhood, women as carers in old age. The findings are a kind of experiment in where to go looking for the lonely and provide a feminist language that accommodates all of loneliness's gendered subjects. One of the most interesting insights of the study is the way in which loneliness provides a vocabulary for revealing the constrictedness of gendered relations in private and public space, and it opens up new questions about the connection between public resources and the management of isolation. One of the key questions that studying a history of the emotions poses is the difficulty of measuring and calibrating its effects. Eleanor's research, as we're going to find out in a minute, is so exciting because it uses the technology. I'm yet to hear this paper, but from my first takes at least, of mapping in order to show how loneliness can be visualised and charted. And the process it brings to light, as we shall see, how feminist networks work. In many ways, what we might find out is what we might kind of think about is the affordances of technology, academic resources, and the knowledge that study groups in the 80s did not have at their disposal. This is a group on loneliness and technology, so it's interesting to think about the dynamics of technology here. Eleanor describes the mapping of networks of feminist loneliness as a kind of experiment in where to go looking for the lonely. Experiments are perhaps exactly what is needed to make loneliness historically legible. I will now pass over to Professor Jolly, who will introduce Eleanor's paper. Margareta Jolly is Professor in Cultural Studies at the University of Sussex School of Media Arts and Humanities and Principal Investigator to the business of women's words, purpose and profit in feminist publishing, which explores the feminist publishing revolution that unfolded during the UK women's liberation of the 1970s and 1980s. And I would just add to her bibliography that she's written a wonderful book on women writing letters. And I think that I'm sure that it has kind of opens up lots of kind of parallels to the kind of business of mapping. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you too. And I'm also really looking forward to this paper. This is Eleanor's very original development, really, of one part of the Business of Women's Words project. So as said, that project, thank you, Leverhulme Trust, I have to say that, is a partnership with the University of Cambridge, and I'm very happy Lucy Delap is here. I see she's also in the project, and University of Sussex and the British Library, and we've been looking at, maybe familiar to you, some wonderful publishing businesses, including Virago, also Bogle Louverture, a Black women's business, Black Power business, the Women's Press. There are many that we've been looking at from the point of view of a sort of hidden history of feminist enterprise, but also magazines, including Women's Report and very well known Spare Rib. So that's what we've been doing, tracing this business history. But out of this, one part of it, and Lucy Delap has been very important here, we've pulled out a digital map of enterprise, but also generally life and leisure in the women's movement based on the listings and letters of Spare Rib. And Eleanor has been leading on this project for the last year and is going to show you the results, show you the map, and hopefully play with it a little bit. But it was her idea to extrapolate from that a question about loneliness and connection and community. And it's really exciting, and it really makes great use, I think, of something that's quite an experiment within our project, which is to find a geography within a magazine. So I'm not going to say any more. I want to leave the time for Eleanor, but yeah, over to you.
Thank you, Margareta. Thank you, Jess, for having me. And Celeste Orr will also be joining me later to respond to my paper on feminist loneliness. So I'm quite new to thinking about this idea of feminist loneliness, but my previous research on lyric representations of women's imprisonment and explored the relationship between space and solitude and gender, and poetry's capacity or incapacity to overcome the isolation of the prison cell. But this evening, I'll be talking about what I'm calling networks of loneliness within the women's movement, and how digital mapping technologies, as Jess and Margareta have said, makes historic feminist loneliness legible. I want to begin by positioning myself in relation to all this. I wrote this paper on loneliness out of my own loneliness or solitude this year. Alone in my flat at times with my cats. Cats have a long history of keeping solitary humans from total loneliness. In the 9th century, a medieval Irish hermit wrote of his cat, Panga, "How happy we are, alone together, scholar and cat." To couch this in more political terms, Hannah Arendt has written of how thinking is not a solitary, but a lonely, thinking is a solitary, but not a lonely business. Loneliness is not being able to keep myself company. Arendt offers a further definition of loneliness, which is particularly apt for a paper on the women's liberation movement, a movement which sought to transform the conditions of everyday life. And I want to leave it here by way of an epigraph. Arendt writes, "While isolation concerns only the political realm of life, loneliness concerns human life as a whole." So I was going to start by introducing the Business of Women's Words project, Margaret and Jess have already told you something about that project. My focus has been on Spare Rib magazine, the leading publication of the women's liberation movement and the longest running feminist magazine in Britain. And what has emerged for me out of my research on Spare Rib is the very personal way in which feminist publishing generated counter-publics through which feminists discovered each other and created alternative cultural networks. This finding emerged specifically from my work on the Spare Rib map, the first digital map of the women's liberation movement, which I will show you shortly, and from my immersion in the data sample which populates the map, thousands of letters and listings taken from across its entire run. The Spare Rib map represents only a slice of the magazine's overall content, about 8% of Spare Rib's listings and 24% of its letters. But from this sample alone, it is possible to see that Spare Rib letters and listings were sent from and took place in every corner of the UK and Ireland, from Guernsey to the Outer Hebrides. With hundreds of listings and a dozen or more letters per issue, the map offers a fresh grasp on the places and spaces of the women's movement and sheds new light not only on what the movement was, but on where and when it was active across the UK. It does confirm the movement was city and university town centric, but it also reveals the wider provincial spread of the movement. Spare Rib was a site of exchange, both figuratively of ideas and feelings and care, but also crucially economically. The women's liberation movement has generally been thought of as existing somehow outside of capitalist transactions, but the Spare Rib listings reveal that there were many women-centered businesses. And where the listings tell us what products and services the movement produced, from bed and breakfasts to dating agencies, to therapists, to bookshops, the letters tell us about the consumers of these products and services and how readers felt about such exchange, including pricing, spending power, questions of income and earnings, and the whole capitalist system. In visualizing these networks, the map reveals the reach of a movement known for its decentralized activism. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, the movement operated through a web of local groups and centers, rather than via a single top-down organization. I'll be drawing on the Spare Rib map throughout my talk, firstly to discuss specific networks of feminist loneliness, and secondly to demonstrate how the map can be used to rethink the geographies of the women's movement. So loneliness or isolation was a driving force behind Spare Rib's establishment. A key aim of its founding manifesto was to reach and connect women outside political networks, building on the theory that women were structurally divided by the nuclear family. I quote from that manifesto: "The concept of women's liberation is widely misunderstood, feared, and ridiculed. Many women remain isolated and unhappy. We want to publish Spare Rib to try and change this." The way to achieve that aim, as Spare Rib's founders saw it, was to produce a popular, accessible publication which would put women's liberation on the newsstands. Another early proposal for Spare Rib read that, I quote again, "There is the most urgent need for a magazine that will reach all women. That is, women who are frustrated by the limitations of existing magazines. Commercial journalese gives unrealistic solutions to problems, thus increasing loneliness and isolation." End quote. Lucy Delap has written of Spare Rib's special remit to reach women who had little contact with the organised women's movement, an objective which was written into the magazine's business model. In an application for Greater London Council funding, its editors claimed that it had, I quote, "a crucial place in the women's movement. As we have commercial distribution, we are in a unique position of being able to reach women who are isolated or uninvolved." And we can see here that the commercial was intimately related to the question of loneliness or isolation. So the responses of readers seem to bear this out. The magazine received letters from all over Britain that confirmed its lifeline status. A Scottish reader based in Motherwell, for example, had come across feminism at university in Glasgow in the late 1970s, but felt that, I quote, "Now I belong to the real world. I never come into contact with anyone remotely feminist, and I'm finding this very difficult. I live for spare rib every month." Someone at the magazine must have written to her, and she was deeply grateful. Writing back, "I am sorry if I have burdened you with all my troubles and feelings, but I am so glad I have found someone to share my thoughts with." That's a letter that was never published in Spare Rib, but it can be found in Feminist Archive South. In 1974, a reader writes that I have been led into believing I am crazy because I find life so difficult in a male-orientated world. Then I read your magazine and I find I am right. Life is hard, bloody hard. But the knowledge I am not alone and not crazy makes me feel so much better and stronger. Or, as a working class lesbian reader from 1990 put it, Spare Rib is, above all, a networking system for women. If nothing else, it puts women in contact with each other. This is vital, since women are so isolated. So the letters pages of Spare Rib constitute what we might call a technology of loneliness. As Margareta Jolly has discussed, letter writing was a common practice in the movement, repurposing a feminized domestic activity in a political context. So the Spare Rib letters, as you will have begun to see, are often heavily laden with emotion, most frequently anger, but also solidarity, criticism, distress, and praise. And they make up a large proportion of the entries on the Spare Rib map. And what you will see visualized here on the map when you filter by letters, and I'm sorry, I wanted to show this to you, but I've belatedly realized that I can't both read my paper and also navigate the map on the same screen at the same time. But I'll bring this up later. The map visualizes all of these letters that were sent from all corners of the UK, which I would like to suggest is a version of what Lauren Ballant terms an intimate public. And Ballant contrasts this form of virtual community to the masculine civic public sphere and asks us to consider the limits of its often emotive privatizing quality alongside its queer feminist potential. Certainly the epistolary community of Spare Rib readers was ambivalent and critical, and not all women who write into Spare Rib found solace or solutions to their isolation within the movement. One reader writes that the movement should be renamed Some Women's Liberation. Another reader finds that Spare Rib encourages the myth that the feminist movement is full of petty socialist cliques. And another finds the tone of the magazine makes her feel like she has to apologize for being both a married woman and a feminist. Other readers describe how they feel excluded by the dominance of middle class and white women within the movement, by the emphasis on theory over practical politics, and sometimes even by their choice of clothing. In 1978, a reader who attended the Women's Liberation Movement conference in Birmingham found her experience of the conference, her first real contact with the movement, alienating and threatening. She went with a friend who was treated with hostility for wearing a skirt and found that the policy of non-organization and structure led to the loudest voices dominating the proceedings. She writes that she and her ordinary friends will never try to establish contact with the movement again. Isolation, of course, takes many forms, and the isolation of the archetypal white middle-class housewife was not at all the same as the isolation of, for instance, British Asian women, which derived from increasingly harsh immigration policies that separated spouses and dependents, as described in Amrit Wilson's Finding a Voice, Asian Women in Britain. In 1981, an isolated Asian woman reader writes to Spare Rib, "I hope you will print my letter, as at home I have no voice, and if I can't find a voice through you, then where else can I turn?" Structurally embedded forms of loneliness and isolation, deeply lodged as they are at the heart of family structures, migration, politics, and patterns. Racism, capitalism, and patriarchal life was something that feminist communities could not entirely overcome. So how did SPERIB attempt, valiantly, if not always successfully, to bridge causes, communities and commitments, and to reduce feminist loneliness? The listings pages of SPERIB, where consciousness-raising groups, events, jobs, and lonely hearts were advertised, were an especially important forum for isolated feminists and a unique activist resource that would certainly not be found in mainstream magazines. The SPERIB digital map draws extensively on the listings to map the networks of feminist activity that took place across the UK in the 70s and 80s, and visualises what I am calling the networked solitudes of the women's movement, isolated yet connected and mappable via the pages of SPERIB, from an isolated feminist located in the Scottish Highlands to a lonely lesbian who seeks the same for friendship in Norfolk. The magazine promoted regional conferences, such as that organised by Bridgewater Women's Liberation in 1977, which discussed rural women past and present. In the same year, it also listed the feminist newsletter Country Women, which aimed to provide a network of support for isolated women. In 1981, SPERIB reviewed the first Southwest Rural Women's Conference, which, I quote, gave a chance for isolated groups and individuals to meet. And from 1984, a pioneering book trade promotion event, the annual Feminist Book Fortnight, not organised by, but generously advertised in SPERIB, also helped to extend feminist literary networks across the country. Despite such efforts, SPERIB's coverage was often London-centred and became more so in the 1980s, when grant funding from the Greater London Council required them to foreground the needs of Londoners. So where the letters raise issues and make often stringent criticisms, the listings offer solutions to some of these problems, arguably offering a gentler answer to feminist loneliness. The map brings together the letters and the listings and enables us to ask, how are readers' issues and demands met by services and events? And can we relate patterns of consumption and production to political belonging? To map the networks of feminist loneliness, to explore the places and spaces of the women's movement, is to rethink centre and periphery dynamics and the relationship between isolation and community. I will discuss some examples of that distribution of supply and demand, particularly as that demand related to loneliness, in the next part of my paper. One of the most important resources SPERIB provided for isolated feminists were its Lonely Hearts pages. A few heterosexual ads, including some from men, were printed in SPERIB's early issues, but over time, SPERIB's Lonely Hearts listings emerged as a service exclusively used by and for bisexual and lesbian women. A search for Lonely Heart on the SPERIB map generates a visualization of this queer network of feminist loneliness. The Lonely Hearts business was booming as never before, as a Daily Mail article put it in 1970. SPERIB's Lonely Hearts participate in this rapid growth in the dating industry in the latter half of the 20th century, and its dedicated national public forum for lesbians and bisexual women helped to form the distinctively new demographic of feminists interested in romantic or erotic relationships with women. While not an explicitly lesbian feminist magazine, SPERIB's circulation of around 30,000 in the early 80s was far bigger than that of exclusively lesbian feminist magazines such as Sappho, which had a circulation of only 900 to 1,000. The Lonely Hearts were also a source of revenue for SPERIB, and thus not only a romantic, but also a commercial site of exchange. Some of my favourites of the often witty and lyrically worded Lonely Heart ads include the tall, attractive gay woman, 22, who is tired of watching the sun go down all alone in East Anglia in 1987, a woman in Cumbria who describes herself as a hapless, discontent lesbian who seeks others' please help in June 1985, a Lancashire-based gay feminist in her 40s who penned an ad that reads, "Life's terrific for two, lonely for one," and seeks a non-smoking, defined, mature female with sense of humour for caring relationship in 1983, and the exuberant ad placed by a Cambridge lesbian celebrating midlife in 1991, who relishes words, wine, and women. The Lonely Heart columns are not the most obviously activist aspect of Spare Rib or of its contribution to the women's movement. But, as Sarah Ahmed says, lesbian feminism can bring feminism back to life as a way to live one's life that does not separate politics from that living. As a record of everyday lives, in their listing of specific context-bound interests, in their articulation of the struggle to connect with others, and through their humour, they emphasise the less ideological but equally vital social aspects of women's liberation at that time, and correspond to Arendt's definition of loneliness as concerning human lives as a whole. The map shows that more than half of the relationship-themed listings and letters were sent by readers living in provincial parts of the UK, for whom Spare Rib constituted a unique and personal form of feminist outreach. However, lonely feminists were not confined to those provincial parts of the UK, and in London in 1979, we can find a plaintive ad asking, "Are there any other lonely feminists at home with small children within reach of Pimlico?" The big cities, of course, more than half of Londoners find that the capital is a lonely place to live, according to a YouGov survey from 2019. The big cities could generate a distinct and sometimes even more oppressive form of loneliness than that produced by geographical isolation. So the personal ads published in Spare Rib were not all from women looking for romance either, but also from women looking for friendship, companionship, or house shares, and other non-heteronormative forms of sociality. For example, a Shropshire lesbian seeking friendship placed an advert in 1985. A West Glamorgan-based lonely female couple sought other gay couples aged 30 or over in 1989. Lesbian mothers would write in seeking friendship or housemates. Or, as a pregnant lesbian mother from Suffolk put it in 1988, I quote, someone to share bills, bed, and butlins. The lines between friendship and romance blur in many of the ads, and in Kent, in 1979, a woman raising 2 children who wants to contact similar advertises in the groups section of the listings rather than the Lonely Hearts. In early issues of Spare Rib, the local groups section was originally listed under the heading Isolated Readers Seeking Women's Lib Groups. The shift in the taxonomical language used from that of isolation to that of collectivity indicates a movement growing in confidence, power, and numbers, but also the symbiotic relationship between the two. Feminism is known for its collective organising, but that urge to form collectives, groups, and networks was catalysed and preceded by, as we see here, loneliness. Some of those isolated readers from the early issues of Spare Rib included a Northern Irish mother living on a housing estate who recently took my courage in my hands and placed an advert, RE Women's Liberation, in our local paper. I'd like to try again, but I can't afford to keep paying for adverts. And 2 isolated women living in an isolated part of the country also feature. That isolated part of the country is Cockermouth in the Lake District. And they say that they are desperate to organise a women's lib group. There are isolated readers located as far apart as Jersey, Stafford in the Midlands, Maidstone, Kent, Plymouth, and Blackpool. So Spare Rib provided a forum for all of these isolated feminists, a means of communication and outreach. There is evidence too that feminist networking within the pages of Spare Rib was a 2-way street. Individuals would write in looking for help or friends or romance, and organisations would place ads for helplines or dating services, answering that need, a sort of call and response. For example, an 18-year-old living in Bradford placed an advert in Spare Rib's 1982 June issue, describing herself as an emerging lesbian who is still exploring her sexuality. In 1987, a 20-year-old from Winchester similarly describes herself as an emerging lesbian seeking others for mutual support and friendship. By way of answering this need, dating or networking services such as the Zenith's Friendship Club advertised its nationwide services as especially helpful to emerging women in the pages of Spare Rib in 1987. Other dating services, such as Gayway, Matura, for women over 35, and Kenrick, also advertise frequently in the pages of Spare Rib. A typical Kenrick ad reads, lesbian, isolated, Kenrick organises social events for you to meet others. There were also local pen pal clubs, such as Lesbian Link in Wales, a pen friendship agency for older, isolated and/or disabled women, or Club Aphrodite in Whitstable for lesbian pen friends. Correspondence agencies, such as Ariadne, were keen to emphasise that the services they offered were discreet and sincere, in a reflection of the hostility to which queer and lesbian women were frequently subject. Indeed, Spare Rib encouraged those who sent in Lonely Heart adverts to give a PO box number rather than a home address to avoid becoming the target for pranksters and homophobes. As a consequence, there are many more Lonely Heart ads in the pages of Spare Rib than appear on the map. In 1992, just before Spare Rib's own final issue, the collective closed down the relationships section, reporting that we have received many complaints about bogus adverts, some of which have recently led to very serious and dangerous situations for women replying to the ads. So some of the most regular listings in Spare Rib were for lesbian magazines, such as Sappho. Sappho's byline in the mid-70s proclaimed it to be the only lesbian feminist magazine in Europe, and Sappho held regular magazine meetings in a Notting Hill pub from the early 70s to the early 80s. Loneliness, again, is a foundational theme. In a letter printed in an early issue of Sappho, a Daily Mirror journalist writes that she had long felt that there has been a real need for the kind of help and advice which Sappho can offer to the many lonely girls that write to me about lesbianism. From the 1980s, there was also Sequel, a bi-monthly magazine specifically aimed at isolated lesbians. These magazines, however, had much narrower constituencies than Spare Rib. A 70s feminist directory notes of Sappho that the readership supplies most of the content. Other kinds of projects also sprang up in response to a specifically lesbian or queer feminist loneliness. There were a number of helplines, including Lesbian Switchboard, Lesbian Line, and local services such as Lancaster Gay Women's Line. One such helpline was actually set up by the woman who ran Sappho. There were also a series of lesbian bed and breakfasts, which emerged in the 1980s. So I've been interrupted by a cat. Wild Lily's B&B is a wonderful example of these. It was a bed and breakfast based in Swansea, and it advertised itself wonderfully as a retreat for lesbians in love, windy walks, continental breakfasts, don't delay. In 1988, Spare Rib carried a listing for something called the Border Women Project, which aimed to bring together lesbians along the rural border of Powys, Herefordshire and Shropshire. The listing announces that the group had a successful first meeting and that our first big event open to all women will be a disco/party at Leominster Community Centre. That project flourished and the group continues to grow. They can now be found online at borderwomen.net. They've gone virtual. So it is clear that a priority for feminists, and particularly lesbian feminists in the 70s and 80s, was communication, overcoming isolation and establishing networks through the medium of feminist publications, such as Spare Rib. The resulting proliferation of a lesbian infrastructure of sociality and leisure coincided with the increasing public recognition of lesbians in Britain in the 1980s. In the last part of my paper, I want to think more about the uses and spatial politics of feminist loneliness. So I think what is important to note is when looking at a map of the UK, is that the notion of what is provincial or isolated versus what is central and metropolitan is very much determined by national imaginaries. Britain is a relatively small, densely populated island, but has what might be called a narcissism of small differences, which operate as a national philosophy and involves a totally different conception of distance and travel to that, for example, of North America. Rehearsing a familiar British idiom, a letter sent to Sperib in 1991 reminds the collective that there is life north of Watford. The tension between centre and periphery, or metropole and provinces, accelerates for Sperib in the 1980s, when heated and often painful debates over the magazine's increasingly international focus played out in the magazine's letters pages. While some readers complained that there was too little content to do with Britain, however, others praised Sperib for reminding, I quote, those of us born British that we are living on a small and not so very important island. Hazel V. Carby in Imperial Intimacies, A Tale of Two Islands, connects, I quote, the marginalisation of areas dismissed as rural backwaters and the marginalisation of colonies. To explore such a relationship is beyond the scope of this paper, but I want to briefly look at one example of that intersection between the imagined provinces and a colonial narrative in this letter written to Sperib in 1976, which gives us a sense of how women from the so-called provinces felt about such a designation. The letter is titled Do-Gooders in the Jungle. Dear Sperib, your campaign to launch Sperib in Birmingham may be well-intentioned, but you remind me of the Victorian do-gooders who dashed off into the jungle. Reading that I live in a black spot makes me feel a little angry and a little uncivilized. Just because women here do not buy spare rib, it does not mean they're being pulled into caves by their hair. Still, you do a good job, and I'll keep reading and agitating in my own small way. Yours, a native of Brum. This letter was written in response to Sperib's region by region campaign, which aimed to gain more readers and contributors, and which launched in Sperib issue 50 and described Birmingham as their first target and a real black spot where less than 300 copies of Sperib were sold monthly. This campaign was both a sign of Sperib's commitment to reaching more women outside London and of its own colonially inflected imaginings of its missionary-like role within the movement. Although the fact Sperib published this letter demonstrates its characteristic openness and commitment to debate within its pages. In 1984, Sperib publishes a letter from another angry reader who writes in to withdraw her subscription and to say that she has neither the time nor money to waste on something that is so distant from my provincial life in Bradford-on-Avon. The Sperib letters then, as well as confirming Sperib's lifeline status for the isolated, supply a critical and at times analytical record of its mission to combat political isolation. In 1984, a reader writes that Sperib is too London-centric and makes the calculation that 73% of the listings are currently London-based and that 44% of the consciousness-raising groups advertised were in London. She asks, does so little activity happen outside the grey metropolis? In 1992, a reader laments the diminishment of the listings section, writing that, when I first subscribed to Sperib in the early 1980s, the classified section was alive with women's groups all over the country. Now there seem to be none. It is also very frustrating to those of us who live a long way from London to see organisations such as the Feminist Library crying out for volunteers and not be able to do anything. There may very well be some useful work we can do in our own areas if we can only find one another. If only we can find one another. This letter describes or inscribes traces of loneliness's galvanizing and frustrating effects, as well as reflecting the decline of the women's liberation movement in Britain in the 1990s. Sperib then, despite its aspirations, its frequent editorial interventions urging contributions from women based outside London, and more sustained attempts to build these networks, such as the Regions campaign and Feminist Book Fortnight, did not always succeed in bridging geographical, class, or racial divides. There were also logistical challenges to overcome, including the slowness of communicating by post. In 1980, a contributor in Leeds apologised for missing a deadline, noting, I don't mean to be difficult, but it's just that second class and parcel post from London to here frequently takes a week. Your letter took 5 days. and the difficulties of persuading national retailers, such as W.H. Smith's, to distribute spare rib. There are numerous letters from readers complaining that spare rib is not stocked by their local newsagents. So, understanding spare rib as a node in networks of feminist activities across the UK in the 70s and 80s suggests new ways of approaching its content and its more practical reimaginings of the organisation of the whole of human life. Its lesser known pages, the letters and the listings, constitute what Lucy de Lapp has described as an archive of otherwise unrecorded feminist activities, networks and outposts. Using these records to map networks of loneliness over time gives us a broader portrait of feminism's imagined community, less skewed towards intellectual and ideological debate and more widely dispersed over the regions, towns and villages of the UK. So I want to give you the opportunity to explore the spare rib map for yourselves, and I'm going to put the link to the map in the chat now, and we have some 5 to 10 minutes to work out how the map works and to try out some searches. My plan is to talk through how the map works in the background while giving you a chance to explore it yourself.
Eleanor, I'm wondering, given that you couldn't show us some of your pre-prepared examples, I think it would be really helpful if you could just share your screen first and just show, you know, even just a little bit before people explore for themselves. I hope I'm not saying what I would like, but I think that might be quite good. Just even showing how you you know, you got, well, just anything first before we do that.
Yeah, no, I agree.
Share screen.
Good idea. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen now. Here is the map. Okay, let me know if that's not working. So, as you can see, this is the map in its, it is now the map in its sort of full view mode.
And maybe I'm coming in here, but I'm thinking also to show where it first show this, or afterwards show the British Library page where it is, just to give the context of all the different articles about it and instructions. And
yes,
you could do that after if it's easy. Yeah,
sits here. So the spare rib map can be found on the British Library website, and this is its page here. And there are various articles attached to the map, which you can click through. There's a guide, there's an explanation of how and why we made the map. And the place where I was a moment ago was the full screen version, which you can click through to here. So this is the full screen. All the data points you can currently see. These are all of the letters and the listings that make up the data sample on which the map is based. And as you zoom into the map, you can see that these data points start to separate and fan out. And if you click on one of these numbered circles, this one over Nottingham, then you can see you get spirals of data points that have been pinned to that location. And actually Nottingham, this relates to something I mentioned at the beginning of my paper, the way in which the letters provided critique of the movement more generally, but also of spare rib. And here you can see that a letter was sent in 1984 complaining about exploitative working practices in feminist cooperatives. So that's one example of that, that dialogue between letters, listings, spare rib and the movement. Now, as you can see, all the entries are color-coded with symbols. And all the entries have been categorized. If you click in this pop-up box in the bottom right, you can see that there are descriptions for all these categories. There are 14 of them. Took us quite some time to to decide on these categories and make sure that they were sort of capacious enough to to work for all of the data points we were working with, but also to make them specific enough to be useful to researchers. And they range from events and meetings, to lifestyle and leisure, to health, to campaigns, work, and relationships. And if you filter the map by one of these categories, then you can see, for instance, if I filter by business and finance, then you can see all of the data points that relate in some way to business, enterprise, financial questions, often financial concerns that women wrote in about to the magazine. And then you can further filter by letters or listings. So here, if you did filter by letters and business and finance, then you'd only be looking at the letters that concerned often personal financial issues. And if you select listings instead, then you're more likely to be looking at women-owned businesses. And actually there's a wonderful little hub of feminist-owned businesses based in Lampeter in Wales, which is here, where there was a women's cooperative called Ragged Robin, which produced clothing cooperatively. So that's how you can use those filters. I should also say that there is a very useful search bar up on the top right. And this is where you can, for instance, search for the lonely hearts that I mentioned. And this now gives you a visualization of that queer network, which I've been talking about, spread out across the UK, the Lonely Hearts Network. And you can scroll down through this drop-down box. Important to note that it's scrollable to see all of the results. There are lots of those lonely hearts, as you see. To see just the letters and Lauren Ballant's sort of intimate public, then you can simply filter by the letters. And that gives you an idea of that network. As you see, there are far more pins in London than elsewhere, sort of in the hundreds in London, and only double figures elsewhere. But we can also, if I just clear that search again, you can see that, yeah, as far away as Guernsey down here, you have a women's bookshop that was advertising in 1980. And you can go right up to the Hebrides and see a letter sent by a reader who is unhappy with the connotations of the word sisterhood in the 1970s. So that gives you some idea of how to navigate the map. I'm going to stop sharing for a moment.
One more thing would be to show the timeline.
Oh yeah, thank you, Margaret. I almost forgot about the timeline. Let me bring that back. The timeline is really great actually, because it's you can see everything happening in motion. So if you click the little clock symbol here, and then press, I'm going to move my Zoom screen out the way. If you press play, you can then see how the number of activities changed over time, changing density of events and networks and letters and so on. And you can also, rather than just clicking play, you can move this yourself to different years, different issues. And you can see that the 80s was the time when there was sort of most activity, and that activity then dwindles as you move further towards the 90s. Okay.
And I'll add that Eleanor was one of the key reasons this exists at all, because it was really quite technical and complicated to put all that data in and clean it. And you know, we should also acknowledge Zoe Strimple, who worked on that too, and yeah, also Simon Wibberley, who helped develop it. But I find it really fascinating.
Yes. important to acknowledge that this was a real team effort, and it was yeah, conceptualized by Margareta and by Lucy before I arrived on the project. But it's both a research tool, but also a sort of educational resource as well. And one other thing I was going to mention is, if you notice that some entries have got several colours attached to them, and some symbols will be different colours for different data points, and that reflects a data point that has got 3 or more categories, listings that, yeah, we felt we couldn't categorize in one way or another. And so those different color codings and different symbols indicate an activity or a service that contributed to the movement in multiple ways. So I think I'll finish by saying, so I should probably allow enough time for Celeste to speak and for discussion, that I hope that, yeah, that the map shows how the research potential of the Spare archive can be opened up, and how it can act as a lens onto the women's movements, dynamics, geographies, and economies. And I hope that I've begun to show how the movement negotiated and was galvanized by forms of loneliness and isolation. So I'm now going to hand over to Celeste for their response.
I will do a quick introduction. Thank you so much for that fascinating paper, and for talking us through that map, Eleanor. I'm looking forward to coming back to kind of questions at the end. So there'll be a kind of quick discussion after Celeste's paper, and then please do put your questions in the chat. Dr. Celeste Orr is a visiting assistant professor in gender and sexuality in the Gender and Sexuality Department at St. Lawrence University, or is in the process of co-editing, as I've mentioned, the special issue on feminist theory with Dr. Shoshana Magnet, marking the event of feminist loneliness studies. The special issue will unpack and theorize the potential perils and generative possibilities offered up by the profound emotion, loneliness. Additionally, Orr is currently working on their book manuscript for University of British Columbia Press, cripping intersex exorcisms and compulsory dietism. Their research has most recently been featured in Boyhood Studies, an interdisciplinary journal, and Mothering, Mothers and Sport Experiences, Representations, Resistances. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Let me just pull up my paper here. So first I want to say thank you for your talk, Eleanor, and for inviting me to discuss your thought-provoking ideas. Additionally, thank you to Margareta, Jess, everyone else involved in this event, and of course, everyone joining us today. I was thrilled when Eleanor reached out to me to participate in this event because, along with my co-editor Shoshana Magnet, I've been working on a special issue of feminist theory, feminist loneliness studies. I've been thinking about loneliness for a while, and I have no doubt everyone's been thinking about loneliness or thinking about loneliness in new ways, not simply because of this loneliness series, but also because of the pandemic, obviously. I find myself thinking a lot about the politics and ethics of loneliness, the unique loneliness my students, my colleagues, my family, and my friends are experiencing. Loneliness is a political, ethical, and embodied matter. We know mental health disabilities and issues, the effects of loneliness, anxiety, and depression have been central to many conversations around how people are dealing with the pandemic. And I expect those conversations will continue for years to come. In Eleanor's paper about loneliness, I wasn't surprised that she began by remarking on the pivotal role her cats are playing these days in keeping her company. And I'm happy we got a chance to sort of see one of them. We've seen pet adoptions increase this past year, and many people have written about the importance of interspecies relations during the pandemic. In fact, one article in our forthcoming special issue addresses this. And I must confess, I found myself scrolling through cat adoption websites quite often this past year. And Eleanor is right. Cats have a long history of keeping solitary humans from total loneliness. Cats are also associated with wayward, troublesome, or crazy women, witches, lesbians, spinsters, and even feminists. Playing around with the map, I saw a women's bed and breakfast listing in '92 noting pets are welcome. Various women also write in seeking friendship or romance, listing animals or pets as one of their interests. I have no doubt these women found solace in their pets, perhaps their cats, just like they did in the magazine Spare Rib itself. There's much to appreciate in Eleanor's work, and with the remaining time I have, I want to address two interrelated things. First, reaching. Eleanor uses the word reach several times, discussing how women reach for spare rib as a potential salve to loneliness. Spare rib likewise reaches out to lonely or marginalized women, feminists, lesbians, and bisexual women alike. Second, I want to address the quiet presence of disability in Eleanor's analyses of loneliness. The loneliness that so often characterizes women and queer folks' experiences in a heteropatriarchal world is disabling. It can make one feel crazy. That reaching for a resource like Spare Rib offers crucial context to these women's experiences of loneliness or feeling crazy in a heteropatriarchal world. Eleanor writes, the key aim of Spare Rib was to reach and connect women who would otherwise remain isolated and unhappy. Spare Rib constitutes feminist outreach. Likewise, Eleanor notes, the map reveals the reach of the feminist movement, and Eleanor accounts for women seeking other women who can reach them in their provincial parts of the UK, and notes Spare Rib wanted to reach women outside of London. Eleanor's consistent use of the term reach got me thinking about how loneliness and desire prompt us to reach. Many of these women reached for this magazine and reached for a pen to write into the magazine because they were lonely, desired intimacy, sought recognition, and wanted political change. I'm sure many of us here today have similarly reached, searching for something to explain our experiences, searching for something that will make us feel less lonely. I suspect I'm not alone when I say I continue to reach for feminist and queer literature because it is, in part, a lifeline. There is hope in reaching like that. Hope that one will form connections with others and feel less lonely and crazy. Indeed, intersecting systems of oppression, saneism, racism, sexism, classism, queerphobia, fatphobia, interphobia, and so on, gaslight people. They frame marginalized people as crazy feminist killjoys, perhaps. Forms of oppression can make people feel crazy, create real mental distress, and this isn't a metaphor. Hence, we reach for others like us, for literature about people like us, to make sense of things. This is the politics of loneliness. Drawing from Anne Chekovich's analysis around depression as a public feeling, loneliness, like depression, is a cultural and political phenomenon. Eleanor, noting the anxiety of loneliness, notes one reader who felt less insane after engaging with Spare Rib. Quote, I have been led into believing I am crazy because I find life so difficult in a male-oriented world. Then I read your magazine and I find I am right. Life is hard, bloody hard. But the knowledge I am not alone and not crazy makes me feel so much better and stronger. Looking through the map, I found another woman who wrote in stating, your magazine keeps me sane. It's important to note that words like crazy and insane should not be used lightly. They're typically wielded as ableist and sanist tools of violence, specifically impacting disabled or mad people, queer folks, women, and racialized people. Like other disability studies scholars, I am very critical of the historical and contemporary usages of these words. That said, it's important to recognize that systems of oppression can bring crazy with it, can prompt real mental distress. And as Eleanor implies, there is a connection between systems of oppression, loneliness, feeling crazy, or being deemed crazy. We've seen how reaching for and engaging with Spare Rib has soothed and validated many women. However, what happens when one is disappointed or sees modes of marginalization in the pages of a text they sought solace in? Indeed, Eleanor calls us to consider the isolated, lonely women in the so-called provinces who did not think Spare Rib did a good job bridging geographical divides, or women who were re-isolated or marginalized via racism, femphobia, or xenophobia, for example. Or in my own limited research on the map, we can think about a writer who in 1980 called Spare Rib to drop its white liberalism, or another person who in 81 wrote in rightly criticizing Spare Rib for rejecting Black women's articles about racism, but publishing white women's articles about racism. We can consider a reader who in 73 aptly drew attention to an article that reproduced biphobia, or another writer in 82 explains another article reproduced ableism. As I asked, what happens when one is disappointed or sees modes of marginalization in the pages of a text they sought solace in? For some, perhaps they distance themselves from Spare Rib or the women's liberation movement. They reach elsewhere. Perhaps for some, Spare Rib becomes a site of what Lauren Berlant calls cruel optimism, a term she uses to describe the condition of maintaining an attachment to a significantly problematic object. Perhaps some women might have construed Spare Rib in this way. For others, despite the ways these women have been let down or let down each other, despite how these women have contributed to other women's marginalization and perhaps loneliness, people still reach, strive, and perhaps hope, looking for recognition, political change, and a salve to loneliness and mental distress. They do not want Spare Rib to become cruelly optimistic, so they write in, critique, call out, call in, and demand better from their community. Indeed, as Eleanor notes, Spare Rib is crucially a site of exchange. Spare Rib and this interactive map are clearly an archive, and a very important archive in and of themselves. An archive of feminist letters, an archive of feminist and queer feelings, an archive of the unique loneliness of feminists, lesbians, and bisexual women. Additionally, the letters contained within this archive are a part of a massive archive of feminist letter writing. Feminists write a lot of letters. We've seen that archive grow exponentially this past year, with anti-racist feminists writing to government representatives, workplaces, newspapers, universities, and so on. I've recently seen a surge of anti-transphobia letters be written, virtually shared, and signed because over the past 3 months alone in the US, more than 80 anti-trans bills have been introduced. So what a legacy Spare Rib and so many of us are a part of, a legacy of political change, struggle, troublemaking, loneliness, and also hope. So I'm going to stop there, and I have several questions that I would be happy to ask Eleanor, and I'm sure many other folks are keen to ask Eleanor some questions as well.
Thank you so much for that brilliant response, Celeste. I'm happy for you to, while we wait for kind of questions in the chat, for you to ask away.
Okay, wonderful. I have I've got a bunch of questions, but I think I have two that I would really, really like to ask. And I'll start with this one. So obviously you've been thinking a lot about loneliness, Eleanor, and I'm wondering how your ideas around loneliness, or perhaps your definition of loneliness, has shifted throughout this research, and perhaps especially so because you've been thinking about loneliness during COVID.
Thank you for your response, Celeste. It's wonderful to be able to talk about these ideas with you and with other people. In answer to your question, I guess, you know, it definitely has, partly because I've been starting to think about loneliness more seriously in the last few months. And I'm not sure if that's a consequence of lockdown, as well as, I'm sorry, that was a cat, as well as of course the Bow Project and the way that very much led me through this brilliant archive of Lonely Hearts, to think about that very specific form of loneliness. But I've definitely, I suppose, been been led to think much more about how loneliness can be productive. Of course, in so many ways, it is not necessarily productive at all. But it has struck me, especially through reading thinkers such as Hannah Arendt, who have these really fascinating definitions for isolation, loneliness, and solitude. For Arendt, isolation is a political condition, as I mentioned. Loneliness is a sort of stripping away of companionship. So that's a sort of intrusion into your sort of private life, whereas solitude is actually something which Arendt considers to be properly productive, and a space where thinking can be done. And I think that is definitely something which I've been thinking about more. And in terms of my thinking about feminist loneliness, it's very much taken me to that idea, which I think is central to my paper, which is, and this has also come out of conversations with Jess. So thank you, Jess, for that. This idea of loneliness as a galvanizing, potentially galvanizing force, and the way in which it can precede the forming of communities, political communities.
I just wanted to come in there very kind of quickly, just to say, on the note of talking a lot about Arendt, that in 2 weeks' time, on the Thursday, the 15th of April, we've got a special session with Professor John Rico, Dr. Samantha Rose Hill, and Dr. Christopher Law on thinking loneliness, which is specifically about kind of Arendt and loneliness and kind of philosophy and loneliness. But I will allow, I think Celeste has another question, so I will mute myself, but I just wanted to jump in there.
Yes, no, thank you, Jess, for letting us know or reminding us. It's because I've been thinking about loneliness a lot too, Eleanor, and it's been making me think about a lot of, because you're politicizing loneliness in lots of ways, or like thinking about how loneliness can sort of circulate through this map and your talk. And I've been thinking how loneliness is often in mainstream understandings of loneliness, we see a lot of these sort of suggestions like call a friend or, join a club. But those sorts of suggestions are often not nearly as productive as the ways in which, feminists or anti-racist or anti-colonial studies scholars have theorized loneliness and placed it in a much broader context. So thank you for that. But I do have another question. And I know I mentioned this the other day when we were chatting, that I wanted to address this. So I recently read Jane Ward's new book, The Tragedy of Heterosexuality. If anybody hasn't read it, I highly suggest it. In it, Ward writes about the tragedy of heterosexuality, which in part explains that it's really hard to make a sexual orientation around men loving and desiring women under sexist and misogynistic conditions, right? So how can men love and desire women when our culture teaches men to devalue or undermine women? Which leads me to ask, you mentioned in your talk that a lot of the Lonely Hearts are written by lesbian and queer women, and I can guess why. But I'm wondering what you learned about heterosexual women's loneliness or heterosexual culture in general in the few Lonely Hearts from them.
So it's an interesting question, because the Lonely Hearts have really very, very swiftly become a pretty much exclusively queer space. So you don't really get that inscription of heterosexuality in the Lonely Hearts at all. Where you do see a record, I guess, of heterosexuality is more in the letters pages. For instance, our category discrimination and violence, very sadly, is one place where you might look to find inscriptions of heterosexual relationships and spare rib. And that was one of the categories that very much sort of came to the surface out of the research, and we felt that we had to have somewhere to place mostly letters from women who would write in. talking often at great and painful length about extremely difficult and challenging relationships. And so that is one place that you might go looking for the tragedy of heterosexuality, far less joyful than the Lonely Hearts can be. I suppose one other place that comes to mind, and this is actually not contained within the Spare Rib archive at all, but again, something Jess drew my attention to. There's a pamphlet that was a study that was undertaken by the Hastings Women's Group in I think the late 70s. And it was a study which focused on specific forms of loneliness, and that could include widowhood. It could include the loneliness of being a single mother, or simply being single. I don't know if Jess, you want to say any more about that, because you know more about it, I think, than I do.
I was just reading Margaret's comment. I mean, I think one thing that I will say there is what's so interesting. I mean, as I suppose many second wave feminist kind of pamphlets, projects, kind of study pamphlets, it's an experimentation, that it really kind of charts the ways in which we have this problem, loneliness, but who are loneliness's subjects, and it really kind of records the difficulty of finding those subjects, and notes that actually the people that are most lonely are kind of impossible to find. And so I suppose what is most kind of revealing about that study, from my memory of it, is that kind of sense in which it's this kind of testing ground, and the testing ground of finding the lonely subject is also a testing ground of finding the subject of feminism, and actually realizing that it includes kind of all women, and then kind of feminism being the language that might bring all those women together. So as a kind of early study, it's so interesting in bringing those two kind of ideas together. Obviously, it's a very specific space. I mean, what's so interesting is putting it alongside the map, where you get that, you know, the huge kind of reach of the UK, and you know, and obviously Hastings is a very specific community, and obviously it's a study coming out of Sussex, and so there is that kind of real sense of also of kind of a loneliness project coming from the academy, and actually just trying to do groundwork and really kind of apply those ideas. So it is far less, I suppose, you know, a place to kind of go from that kind of field work and that kind of academic study is to move back to this question of print, because something that kind of struck me is that I really love the way, Eleanor, that you framed this kind of the technology of loneliness that allows us to kind of map these ideas. But it seems that, you know, Spare Rib is print. And I also was thinking when Celeste was saying that they were reading lots of kind of queer and feminist texts over loneliness, that like there is this kind of, it does seem that print is something that brings us together, and that it was central in kind of connecting women at this time. And obviously kind of communications and letters are very tactile, they're very playful. I wonder what we started in our kind of first event of the series where a speaker was discussing kind of Grindr apps. So I believe that you were there, Eleanor, and just I suppose taking us kind of full circle, do we still, I suppose, you know, what are the equivalent of Spare Rib's kind of networks today, and do they kind of can you know, technological meetups have the same kind of community building that we find in these very kind of tangible and creative kind of relations to print? So that's my question. Then I'm going to get to Margaretta's as well, which I'm curious too about your evolving ideas of loneliness in relation to your previous work on the poetry of political prisoners, thinking about that as a productive and creative despite all, but the magazine community was even more prosaic. Sorry, so two kind of big questions to throw at you.
I think that's great, thank you. I think that in some ways they might be related, in my mind anyway. I mean, it's a live question, isn't it? The degree to which, dating apps make us feel less lonely. And of course, you know, you do hear about many success stories, people who've met each other on the app and then got married a few months later. One thing that I think is interesting to note here is that this doesn't really come up in Spare Rib, but I'm aware that there were forms of dating in the 1980s that also made use of like cutting edge technology. So I think that there were sort of dating videos which sort of began to sort of indicate how things might change and move away from exchanges in print to a sort of performance of lonely hearts on screen instead. In terms of print being more tangible and the difference between that and swiping across a screen, I mean, I do think that one of the wonderful things about those lonely hearts are their playful element, and that they're so often knowing and playful, and that actually sort of leads me to Margrethe's question in a way, because it feels like that's a space for creativity. Creativity within the very sort of constrained format of a lonely heart ad. You know what you have to include. You know that you're going to have a witty line accompanied by a list of interests and also a description of the kind of person you're looking for. And within that formula, you find people being very playful, being very inventive. And in that sense, there are perhaps echoes of, as Margrethe is suggesting, the sorts of creativity that can sometimes be prompted by conditions of constraint, which might include writing in prison. There's a bit of a leap there. But I was certainly thinking when I was, thinking and writing about prison poetry, about this relationship between constraint and creativity, and it is something of a truism that constraints can facilitate creativity, and indeed that the prison can be a very productive space for writing, and figures like Oscar Wilde or even Boethius or Gramsci sort of testify to that idea of prison as a space of productivity. But of course, for many, if not most prisoners, a prison cell is rarely going to be a space in which you can produce huge amounts of thoughtful, creative work. And those constraints, or that solitude, can in fact be the opposite of do the opposite of inspiring you to write. It can in fact make you feel as if you are very much shut down and unable to do anything, and entirely unproductive. And that was definitely the experience of the writer at the center of my PhD thesis, Anna Mendelsohn, who found prison to be an extremely nullifying and unproductive space. So I sort of managed to blur those two questions together. I'm not sure if I've fully answered yours, Jess, the tangibility of print versus the greater abstraction of the screen. But I do think it's interesting to think about the ways in which forms of dating then, forms of dating now are and are not related. One thing you'll see in the Lonely Hearts is that a lot of the time women will write that they're looking for somebody based in, e.g. Bradford, or anywhere. And the or anywhere occurs quite often. And there seems to be some sort of gesture there, which I'm interested in, this idea that, of course, you're looking for somebody nearby, and you're looking for somebody who will be proximate to your life, and therefore you imagine them to be proximate geographically. But that or anywhere, which is there so often in the Lonely Hearts ads that it's almost like part of the formula, suggests that women were sufficiently lonely that they were prepared to travel, they're prepared perhaps even to move in order to be close to this romantic partner that they were looking for. And of course, if you use Tinder or a contemporary dating app, then you'll be setting the radius of your search on your phone And there might be something something more to be said about that. I'm not sort of able to crystallize that right now, but I think that little detail from the Lonely Hearts ads is certainly interesting in terms of geographical distance and proximity.
Great. Thank you so much, Eleanor. Sorry, that it was a large question, I suppose. This kind of question of technology versus print and goes everywhere. I wonder if anyone else has any questions from the audience that please do feel free to ask, and if any of our other panelists have anything else that they kind of want to jump in and ask at this point.
Well, Eleanor was answering your question about contemporary dating apps or how these things can relate. It made me think about our conversation the other day, Eleanor, where I was asking similarly, and you mentioned that there were some heterosexual men posting in Lonely Hearts, and it's sort of the way they wrote sort of echoed contemporary ideas on like Tinder. So these men will sort of be looking for a bisexual woman, and we'll see that sort of now crop up on Tinder, couple looking for unicorn, or, that sort of biphobic fetishization.
Oh, I'm muted, sorry, Celeste. And so the question is whether there's evidence of that in the Spare of Lonely Hearts. Just checking I've understood that correctly.
Pardon?
Sorry, just checking I've understood the question correctly. Is that something that I've seen evidence of in the Lonely Hearts?
Mm-hmm.
Not hugely, no. Again, because it was such a sort of lesbian exclusive space, and I think there must have been a fair degree of intervention on the part of the Spare Rib editorial, and presumably there would have been, they'd have taken care not to publish ads that would have been egregiously offensive. There were definitely a couple that slipped through in the early days. There was one from a man, which I think this person described themselves as somebody who respected women's rights and was looking for somebody who would also respect men's rights. And so you do have a hint of that in some of those early ads, in a slightly different way. But I didn't see any evidence of that sort of advertisement. There were plenty of couples who were looking for friendship, but yeah, it was couched in often, very sort of platonic terms. I think I saw a question from Lucy in the chat about who, if anyone, was making money out of loneliness, which seems to be a great question. And I guess I would like to know more in order to be able to answer that question about the other Lonely Hearts columns of the 70s in bigger, more mainstream publications, and the ways that those were operating in the sort of the magazine community. As I say, to some degree, Spare Rib would be making a little bit of money out of the Lonely Hearts ads, I believe, because people would have to pay to place them, but it really wouldn't have been a profit-making endeavor at all for Spare Rib, which was always making rather less than a profit. And I'd be very interested to think more about that question and think about other ways in which loneliness might be a moneymaker.
Margareta has kind of...
Well, yeah, I was going to say this really takes us back to the conundrum within the project as a whole, the Business of Women's Words project, about is there a way in which the small business, the ethical business, or the feminist business, or the women's business could be creating a political service while also trying to be sustainable and perhaps make a profit? And Spare Rib, as you say, it didn't make quite as much perhaps as it would have been good if it had, if you see what I mean. But I think you laid out in the beginning that it did have a attempt to be a competitor to commercial women's magazines, and to use its commercial footing to reach beyond what a political, the many other political ephemeral pamphlets and flyers, which are all brilliant, but maybe we're not quite so ambitious in that way. But I think you've raised the question, and it is a difficult one to answer. I'm not sure I can, but I think yeah, maybe that was a creativity in that, even if it wasn't avant-garde poetry. That's what I was trying to put in the column. You've started me thinking.
There's a question from Anna Miller. Did Jo Cox and the ministry in any way contribute to data gathering analysis, and if so, how? Of the Business of Women's Words project, or?
I might need a bit more explanation in order to answer that question. I'm afraid I'm not quite sure. I think the answer is no, unless I'm mistaken.
Is it a Leverhulme funded project?
It is, but I'm not sure either. Who is Jo Cox and the ministry? Perhaps Alan.
The Ministry of Loneliness.
Ah, right.
With the previous MP.
Yes. But I think you're right. The answer is no. So.
But it's been really exciting to see all the various projects that have sprung up recently in relation to loneliness, and the Minister of Loneliness being one of them, and of course Celeste's special issue on feminist loneliness studies, which was conceived of before the pandemic, it should be said. And there's also the Pathologies of Solitude project at Queen Mary as well, which has been thinking about some of these questions for a few years now.
Great, yes. Does anyone have any final questions or kind of comments that they would like to kind of draw in here? I think it's in many ways a kind of a good moment to kind of lead us towards the present. And I think it's been great this week to kind of revisit the 70s and 80s and to kind of think about beginning to kind of historicize loneliness. So I kind of want to invite you all to give a big round of applause to Eleanor, as well as kind of Margaret and Celeste. It was obviously a joint kind of project. I feel that I've learned so much, and I'm really excited to go and explore that map further. I think it's amazing how kind of digital technology and academic scholarship can come together to really kind of make these networks really kind of legible. And so it's made me think that Sam McBean is doing some interesting work on queer networks that you might want to kind of look at too, that might be kind of interesting. But yes, if everyone's able to unmute yourself, please do give Eleanor, Celeste and Margaret a round of applause.
Thank you, Jess, for having me.
Thank you.
I've been really enjoying the local technology series. It's been really brilliant. And yeah, I'm very pleased to have been part of it. Thank you.
It was, yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, really interesting. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you all so much. And as you're leaving, just, yes, a final reminder, we'll be back on the 15th.
Okay.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Margareta. Thank you, Celeste.
Thank you.
And thank you, Rebecca, as well.